So I think there are a number of things that one could do around that. But number one, I would say, can we make it more fun? And people don't do trials because they're painful to do.
Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the third hearing from the NHS Innovation Life Sciences Commission. My name is James O'Shaughnessy, and together with Professor Mike Buick, I am co-chair of the Commission. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Commission, we were put together to look at some of the critical issues facing particularly the innovation and R&D agenda in the life sciences industry and in the NHS, and indeed in their interaction together. And a large part of the inspiration of why the Commission was brought together was to try and capture some of the magic that happened in the responses of both those sectors during the very difficult times we experienced during the COVID pandemic, which obviously saw a flowering of innovation, clinical research in the UK really at the forefront of pandemic response, and to make sure that we learn the lessons of those difficult times, but when the UK excelled itself, and try to apply those lessons to help the UK achieve its ambitions of being not just a science superpower, but a life science superpower. And that's what we've been doing through our inquiries. We've already had 2 inquiries looking, first of all, at the role of health data, secondly, at integration. And today we are looking at the critical role of clinical research, where we have 2 experiences, I suppose, most recently through things like the recovery principle and REACT and other trials and studies, examples of world-leading research, but also knowing that going into the pandemic, the number of people on clinical trials in the UK was actually falling, and there are some structural issues that we need to address if we want to be a world-leading centre for clinical research, and to bring the benefits of that not just to patients, but of course to the economy as well. So that is what we will be focusing on today, and I'm delighted that we have across the 2 hours of the session 8 fantastic speakers who I will introduce shortly. But before I do that, I just want to give everybody on the Life Science Commission a chance to introduce themselves briefly. So perhaps, Mike, if I can come to you, then Corinna, then Keith.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining. My name is Mike Buick. I'm the co-chair of this commission. I was formerly the Deputy National Medical Director for the NHS, and I now work in consultancy, but I've been working with James now for the past 6 months on this, and it's been a really exciting introduction to how we might restructure and refashion the evidence around these critical areas. I'll move on there.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Corinna Bull. I'm one of the commissioners. I'm a freelance market access and healthcare policy consultant.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Keith Ridge, and until February, I was the Chief Pharmaceutical Officer for England, and I guess I've been in and around this space since the mid-1990s.
Richard, then Harpreet.
Morning, everyone. Richard Stubbs, also a commissioner. So I'm Chief Executive of the Yorkshire and Humber Academic Health Science Network, and also the Vice Chair of the National AIDS Network.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Harpreet Sood. I'm board member at Health Education England, also a GP partner in London. Previously, I was the Associate Chief Clinical Information Officer at NHS England.
Thank you. And then Gillian and Neelam.
Hello, I'm Gillian Lang, a career in evidence and research and guidelines, 20 years at NICE, most recently as the Chief Exec, and still doing quite a lot of stuff at a global level around living evidence.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Neelam Patel. I'm Chief Exec of MedCity, the Health and Life Science Cluster for London, and also Non-Exec Director at the Health Research Authority. Good to be here.
Thank you. So I'm now going to hand over to the 4 participants who have kindly agreed to join us for this first part of the session. They're going to give a 2-minute introduction or pitch as to the areas they think are of most importance in improving clinical research in the UK. And then we're going to have a series of questions from the commissioners to the panel on a couple of topics that we have agreed in advance. I would encourage everybody to use the chat function. In previous inquiry sessions, that has been a lively source of debate, and we can draw out topics and questions that you want to pose in there as well. So do feel free to contribute so we can include that in our discussions. But now I'm going to hand over to the panelists, to first of all Lindsey, then Martin, then Chris and Nicole. If you could give your opening pitches, and then we'll move on to the questions. So Lindsey, over to you.
Thank you very much. So hello, everybody. My name is Lindsey Hughes. I am Director of Research and Engagement at NHS England and part of the Accelerated Access Collaborative. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this today's session on this really important subject. I lead NHS England and the AAC's work to embed research in the NHS. I have a 27-year career in the NHS, and part of that was a significant number of years working in frontline services and also in research, and I'm really proud to be in this leadership position today. A little bit of background in terms of NHS England's role. So we are a committed partner in the government's Research, Recovery, Resilience and Growth programme, which has a comprehensive plan to deliver on the UK clinical research vision. And we set out a second implementation plan with partners earlier this year. We also recently set out, as NHS England and the AAC, our ambitions for research in the NHS at the AAC's June board meeting. And specifically, we committed that every patient should be supported to take part in research that's appropriate for them, and every NHS organisation should be involved in clinical research. So to deliver that, we're looking at a programme of work that will concentrate on 3 really important areas for improvement, and I'm sure that these will come up in the discussion today. Specifically, increasing diversity in research, and that is looking at not only the participants in research, but thinking about diversity in research settings and geographies, and thinking also about the diversity within our research workforce. Increasing the scale of research, so how can we actually make sure that we are offering research out across the whole population, and really increasing the number of participants in our research within the NHS. And then finally thinking about the pace of research, so how do we actually make research more efficient, streamlined, and make it easier to set research up in the NHS. So I'm really looking forward to this morning's discussion and hearing the views of my fellow panelists as well as the commission members, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsey. I'm sure I speak for everyone to say we're delighted to hear that plan, and I hope this commission can be useful in helping you execute against those ambitions. Martin.
Thanks very much. Yes, Martin Landray. I'm Professor of Medicine and Epidemiology in Oxford, Chief Executive of a not-for-profit trials organisation called PROTAS, and for the last couple of years I've been leading the recovery trial with Peter Horby. I was going to sort of, if you like, pitch for the area of regulation. We saw some quite nimble regulation and application of regulations during the earliest phases of the pandemic, and I think it sort of opens our eyes to the opportunity. One of the reports that came out in mid-2021, when the UK had, I guess it's called chairmanship of the G7, was the Pandemic Preparedness Report. And just to quote from that, one of the recommendations was that we should really refocus regulatory guidelines on the fundamental scientific and ethical principles that underpin randomised trials, whilst ensuring flexibility and innovation. And in particular, it went on, the so-called good clinical practice guidelines for clinical trials should be revised to focus on what matters for the generation of actionable information, rather than what is easy to check but less relevant, and should place an emphasis on principles and purpose rather than on process, and I'd add, and paper. So I think that that is a call at a high level for really reviewing how we view regulation. The regulation should be guiding us towards a better future, as opposed to constraining us and tethering us to the past and the complexities of the past. It's a big challenge. Regulating for the future is difficult. Most people's experience, everybody's experiences of the things that went wrong in the past, and so we have to think quite differently. Well, the Good Clinical Trials Collaborative, which I lead, has done that work over the last 2 years, and has produced a set of guidelines which really do exactly that. They focus on the science and the ethical principles that make a good trial. They focus on being clear and concise, on being progressive and durable, and they were developed with a very broad range of international stakeholders, patients, regulators, industry, academia, and so on. Those guidelines, by the way, I'll put the reference in the chat in a moment. That leads us to what can we do in the UK? Well, the UK has had a consultation for a clinical trial regulation to replace the existing regulations, which were based on the directive from 2004, The EU has more now, in the meantime, moved to the EU clinical trial regulation. So we're the only people who are effectively still sticking to the EU directive from nearly 20 years ago. But I think we can do much better than that. We can actually produce a regulation that allows that flexibility in innovation and allows new opportunities. It doesn't constrain people from sticking to their old habits. So if farmers say, well, we can't have one regulation in one particular country and something else everywhere else, sort of reminds me about feeding sheep in a field. You each day you move the electric fence a little bit further back, and there's a new strip of fresh grass. Now the sheep who actually will by and large take opportunity for that new grass, but there's nothing to stop them going and sticking to exactly where they always were. And I think the same is true when one's thinking about what can new regulation do. It doesn't stop you doing what you would do everywhere else, but it gives you new opportunity, which gives new opportunity for growth.
Yeah.
And then finally, I would add is around the application and process of those regulations. And I think we go back to Mike Rawlins's report from the Academy of Medical Sciences over 10 years ago, which I think led to the establishment of the HRA. We really need competent, timely, coordinated, one-stop shop for getting approval, for getting trials up and running. That covers ethics and regulatory, it covers NHS R&D, and it covers data access. At the moment, each of those are by and large dealt with somewhat separately, certainly by separate organisations, and very piecemeal. And even some of them, one has to walk with the same trial hand in from site to site, trying to get approval. That's how we did ethics 25, 30 years ago. It's still how we do a lot of NHS R&D. It's still how we do data access. And I think that one change would make a massive difference to the speed at which we can get trials up and running, and therefore the attractiveness and productiveness of clinical trials and other research in the UK. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. And we're going to get into all of that even more. So thank you, Martin. Chris, and then Nicole.
Thank you, James. Yes, Chris Butler. I'm the chief investigator of the principal and panoramic trials, which were done in the community to identify therapeutics that might be effective against COVID. And we have been the largest, most successful trials worldwide, the envy of the world, as has been said, and randomized over 37,000 people and covering 9 agents in a very short space of time. Now, how have we done that? Well, I guess we've turned the traditional model of research on its head, although that model still stays there, where the patient comes to where the research is happening. There are 9,000 general practices in the UK, and not all of them can be research sites, and none of them have a pharmacy that is research capable next to them. So we identified a model which takes research to the patient, making these trials, I think, the first truly democratic trials in the UK, where patients can participate without ever leaving their homes. So we're not excluding people on the basis of where they live or where they receive their health care anymore with this kind of design, where we can courier medication directly to patients according to randomization and follow them up completely online. So there are models that we are being developed, but it is really difficult given the regulatory environment, as Martin has mentioned. And, you know, there's huge problems that need overcoming to allow us to implement this further, such as skill shortages, but also making it easier for patients to be part of research. We give them a 40-page patient information leaflet that scares them, that just tells them about the problems, a consent form that has 20 subclauses in it. And we make it very hard for clinicians to be part of research because of the regulation and the limits that we have on us on access to data. There are so many different repositories of data, and we need to embed follow up with routine data into usual practice, but getting access to that data is very difficult with the fragmentation and the permissions across all those data sets. NHS 111, for example, didn't really contribute because of its fragmentation, and we didn't know who to talk to and when. Right. So we need to, shall we say, to put it bluntly, get the data protection police off our backs and start helping us when patients give us permission to use all their NHS or healthcare data. Then we don't need to go through millions and millions of processes and procedures thereafter. So my final word is that we need to embed research into routine care in general practice, but also make it possible for people to participate wherever they are in the country, and that this needs to be endorsed from the very top. It needs to be mandated, and it needs to be resourced. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Nicole.
Thank you. Yes, so Nicole Mather, I'm a partner at IBM. We work very closely with Genomics England, but formerly I set up the Office for Life Sciences and was involved in the genesis of the Accelerated Access Collaborative. I'm now a non-executive director at the Wellcome Sanger Centre and also at the Health Research Authority, where we're part of the RRG looking at the integration of the different elements of clinical trials across the system. And we're working to focus on improving the processes while retaining robust methods for the review of clinical trials, with a particular focus on patient involvement, so not engagement at a late stage, but involvement in design, and also simplifying, as Chris just said, those patient information leaflets and so on. So I'm going to have a few thoughts about how technology might help to accelerate trials and focus on 4 areas. So firstly, on experience design. Secondly, on user engagement and keeping a golden thread to focus on whether it's the trialist or the candidate. Some thoughts on recruitment and retention, and finally, remote monitoring. So patient involvement, I think it's particularly interesting in technology. User-centered design is now a very well understood concept, but actually, how have we applied this concept of user-centered design to clinical trials? So thinking about designing trials with the patient, with the trialist at the center, creating a workflow which really works for them and testing that workflow with them so that it fits into their day-to-day workflow and actually makes it easy for them to use. And it makes it easy for companies to engage in the way that we're asking them to. It doesn't increase cost, it doesn't increase complexity. So thinking about user-centered design through the way and the experience of those trialists and of those candidates. Secondly, thinking about that golden thread of user-centered engagement all the way through the process. So CRM packages like Salesforce are used all the time by supermarkets and various other organizations to continue to engage people with their organizations to target the right information, the right messages at the right time in order to help them to buy beer or crisps or whatever it is that they want to market. How can we use these engagement techniques in order to maximize the relationship that we have with clinical trialists or with those candidates or participants in trials, making sure that those forms are designed for people to use, that they're engaging, that they're easy? How can we make a consent engine so that it's really easy for the trialist to slot the data in, and for the patient then to look at that right information? They can read through it in the level of detail that they want, and that process, it can then be integrated into the trial rather than creating a blocker to that progress, pages and pages of sheets. Thirdly, looking at recruitment and retention. I think it's really critical that we go to where patients are, as one of the earlier presenters was saying. How do we use online communities? Things like TikTok and Instagram have the ability to go viral and really reach out. So building on those online communities and working with the patients where they are. We can use data to predict which patients are most likely to be recruited, which are most likely to be retained. And as that data becomes available, I think those tools to predict and retain will be more focused. And those cohorts and databases that we've had in the UK, such as the vaccine portal, will also be a really useful resource. And then finally, remote monitoring. Convenience, making it easy to work around the patients, as Chris has said. We have to make sure that we use that ability to do remote trials, to do trials in their patients, and we can use Internet of Things, so connected devices, to monitor those patients, to collect data, but then we can use that data to predict adverse events and improve the patient security. If my mother was in a care home, knowing that she had Internet of Things devices monitoring her would be a good reason for me to send her to that care home, because she's actually being monitored more closely than she is at the moment. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and we proved that in the dementia test bed that we had in Surrey a few years ago, where we had all of these devices in patients' homes, and that really improved the confidence, for example, of carers in leaving those patients. So I think there's a variety of ways that technology, building on all of these workforce and regulatory issues, can really help to improve the way that clinical trials can be delivered. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. And I do appreciate you giving the patient perspective as well. So I think one of the underappreciated opportunities here is the willingness of patients to be part of trials, if only they could understand how to access them. So I'm going to hand over to you, Gillian, now to lead off on the first topic.
Thanks very much. So the first topic's about workforce. And if we want to do trials that have involved patients and service users routinely, that the outcomes are generalizable, that we're improving patient care and reducing health inequalities, we must have a really good cross-system workforce with the right capacity to do it all well. So the first question is about recruitment. And given the ongoing workforce pressures in the NHS, what methods should we be using to improve recruitment of clinical staff to effectively manage trials? Now, Martin, I know you have to leave at 11, so perhaps you'd be happy to kick this off for me.
The first thing is that trials, it's easier to deliver more trials with the existing workforce if it's easier for that workforce. So the first thing is, can we reduce the barriers that are placed on existing staff? So that might be requirements for extensive extra training that basically comes down to keep good notes of what you're doing, and if there's a problem, tell your boss, which of course is what all medical staff are trained about all the time. So why do we retrain them just because it's a study? So there's a whole bunch of examples of extra stuff we do just because it's a trial and we put on a burden, which makes it, there's an activation energy between a member of clinical staff doing their day job and a member of clinical staff then contributing their patients to trial. So the first thing is reduce whatever barriers there are in that sort of activation energy. Secondly, around the staff where we do need some research staff, is thinking of them as enablers often rather than the sole deliverers. And I think in particular, thinking about how do we make this this a rewarding career. And to that extent, I think that one of the challenges is things around long-term and sustainable positions. So if each trial requires a nurse for 6 months or something, so you end up with and then there's uncertainty. It's very difficult to get good people and retain good people with that constant churn. I mean, you've almost got to hand in their notify them of their end of contract before they've started. So I think actually, could we think about changing things around, for example, year by year costings or trial by trial costings, and try and think about something which was a more sustainable model. So actually one can say, look, actually you're in this post for 3 years, you'll be working on a variety of stuff. So I think there are a number of things that one could do around that. But number one, I would say, can we make it more fun? And people don't do trials because they're painful to do, and they really don't need to be. And that was the feedback we got in recovery, was it actually, for once it wasn't painful.
Some really good points. Thanks, Martin. And Nicole, you also mentioned recruitment when you were doing your introduction. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, I mean, I would only build on what I said before and what Martin said, which is that it's all about making it easy and appealing for people. And I think that over the past years, there has been a focus on safety and increasing the regulation and bureaucracy. And that's why I think we need to step back and look at what the user experience is for those clinical trialists. So how can we make sure that it is an enjoyable experience? That we all can talk about the privilege and value of being involved in medical research. That's why we're all here. But actually, how does it feel day to day? Do we feel that does it feel like there's barriers in the way, or does it actually feel like there's a process which makes it easy, that there's a workflow that makes it easy to do your job well, and the necessary regulation is there to enable you to do a good job, rather than putting up barriers and making your day-to-day life more of a challenge. I think also, though, that we need to make sure that there's a culture of respect for research. And sometimes research feels like an add-on. And I think actually NIHR has been working very hard to embed research within every trust. But are we doing everything that we can to embed that research culture in medical student training, for example, and so that research becomes a normal part of clinical life? Clinicians are very stretched, but I think it's a cultural point and understanding and respect for clinical research, which we all know leads to better outcomes, which means that we should seek to embed it in medical training as well. Thank you.
And the next question is about new roles. What new roles, or indeed do we need any new professional roles, new training programs to support the existing research delivery workforce, particularly to ensure diversity and inclusion in clinical research? And I think, Lindsey, you mentioned, was it you that mentioned diversity when you were doing your introduction? Certainly, or somebody did. So if someone would like to come back on that question about new professional roles, ensuring diversity, that would be brilliant.
Yeah, hi Jill, thanks very much. So probably concentrating more on the kind of how do we help the workforce to ensure they've got diversity and inclusion in clinical research? And I think there are two areas here, possibly more, but two key areas for me. And I think Nicole and other people have touched on this. There's the diversity and inclusion that we need to make sure that we've got in actual participants in research. So we have got that generalizable evidence, and that we are ensuring actually that all parts of the population have access to clinical research, because that's the other reason it's really important to make sure people have access, is that they then get the access to those breakthrough treatments. So really thinking about how do we support the workforce to think about that diverse population, and how do they engage with those populations, and so probably training programs around that, but also thinking about work that my team are doing around development of toolkits to support the research workforce to actually engage with communities that are seldom heard. We've also got the Core 20+5 framework in NHS England, looking at removing health inequalities, and we're also thinking about how do we support systems. So how do we support the new ICSs? And I know we'll come on to those in a bit more detail later, but how do they need to be considering how they identify their research needs for those populations within that Core 20+5 framework, and how do they have those conversations with those populations so that actually they're engaging them, and going to James's point earlier, and making sure they're aware of the research opportunities and their ability to participate. So that would be my kind of first point around inclusion and diversity. I think the other thing is that, again, Nicole alluded to, is how do we actually ensure that that inclusion and diversity is embedded in research design, development, delivery, and also reporting and publication. So how do we ensure that our populations are kind of views and their ability to contribute is embedded from the end-to-end process for research? And I think that is an area that NIHR have made great strides in, and HRA are also doing a huge amount of work around that. And as the RRG and the implementation plan, we're really focusing on making sure that we've got those training programs, those opportunities, and ensuring that the research workforce is prepared for that. So I'll stop there because I know there's other people that want to contribute, but I think those two areas that are absolutely key.
Yeah, no, thanks. And I can see Chris has got his hand up, and I just wondered, Chris, I know you've obviously got a contribution. If you might also want to say something about whether we need any new types of roles, any new professions in amongst all of this. Then.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yes, I think perhaps a key theme that unites many of these aspects that I'd like to bring us to is more often using novel, more modern trial designs. So traditionally, we've set up a trial for a particular, say there's a drug, well, there's one drug in the trial or maybe two, whereas, principal panoramic other trials are platform trials where the infrastructure is long lasting, and then you can add in treatments as the trial goes along without having to start a new treatment each time a drug comes along. And then as soon as you hit thresholds for futility or success, you can ditch a drug, put it out, and then get more in. So you've got a platform, which is a research infrastructure that perpetual, if you like. Now, Martin's already mentioned that to achieve that, you need to change your funding system. And instead of going project by project, I think we need to be funding for much longer and for adopting sort of platform trial approaches. And then that allows you to retain your expertise and keep people in post. Because as Martin mentioned, what happens now, people get good at a topic, but they know their particular trial is coming to an end in December, so they jump ship, and you lose that expertise and continuity, and it's very inefficient to research fund that way. But that type of trial does require different methods, often Bayesian statistics, for example, and we've got a skill shortage there. So we need to enhance our capacity for let's say, modern trial design, different forms of statistics, more expertise in patient-centered outcome measures, and that needs to resonate also with the regulators who, I don't believe that NICE, for example, always understands Bayesian approaches to probability and so forth. So that kind of intellectual capacity needs developing with those particular expertise. And embedded in those platforms, then you can have people whose role it is to promote inclusion and diversity. And we worked with Mahendra Patel, for example, who was part of our management group, who did some tremendous work with us. So we went, for example, to the University of Bolton, where students year on year were promoting research uptake amongst minority ethnic groups, and setting up stalls in malls and so forth, and spreading the word about research participation. And that kind of project, there were many others, needs to, I think, be embedded in a core portfolio on these platform trials, which I think is the way to go. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to come to Keith in a moment, but some good points about relevant expertise. And what I've heard is sustainable research infrastructure, sustainable funding, and sustainable posts. So some really important points for us to take away. Keith.
Thanks, Jill. Not wishing to be controversial, but I wonder if you'd regard, by and large, the world of clinical trials really to be the domain of the medical profession, i.e. doctors. And actually, much more effort needs to be made to open it up to others. So I know much more about the pharmacy profession. So we now have about 5,000-6,000 clinical pharmacists in general practice. They're all prescribers. They're all educated to M level, same as academic level of medicine. And yet, and indeed, every pharmacist will become out as a prescriber from 2026. So there's another opportunity. So why do you think that trials and clinical trials are really seen as the domain of the medical profession?
That's a really, really good question. And I've thought about that over many years, but I don't think it's my role here to be answering the questions. I'll let the panelists come back to that. I have got one final question to ask, which I will ask, but within the context of that, if people can also think about Keith's question, and is it just about doctors, to paraphrase badly. So my final question is about integrated care systems. What strategies should the new ICSs consider to optimize capacity for clinical research in the NHS organisations that they've got within their patch? So how do they optimize capacity? Who would like to start with that? You had your hand up a moment ago, Lindsey, I think, so I could be bold and come back to you.
Absolutely, thanks, Jill. I was going to respond to Keith's point, and I was nodding away as he was talking about different professions. I'm an AHP by background, and so just to address Keith's point in the first instance, absolutely, we need to be looking across the whole workforce to ensure we've got the capacity to deliver clinical trials. I think it's a cultural, traditional medical world, but that doesn't mean that it should stay that way. Within NHS England over the last 12 months, we've had the CNO's research strategy, we've had the AHP research and innovation strategy published, and And there's a lot of work going on through RRG and through NIHR to look at the opportunities for the wider workforce in terms of training programs and academic programs. So I think that's a really important point that Keith makes, and I think there is a lot of progress there. To the ICSs, I think they offer us a huge opportunity to look at research in a different way. Going to, speaking to points that we've already heard around streamlining and making things easier and more efficient, there is a huge opportunity to think about how we do that across a kind of a system and how we do that across an ICS patch. How can we think about all the things that people have talked about in terms of setup of trials? Can we think about kind of costing, contracting, building on the National Contract Value Review Programme that we've got with NIHR and NHS England, and how is that possible to do that across an ICS patch? We don't know the answers to that yet, but we're looking to have those conversations. Can we streamline approvals? Can we think about research delivery and how an ICS would use their expertise and their workforce across that patch, making sure that they've got flexibility within their research workforce and they can deploy that resource across the different kind of different settings. So going to Chris's point about primary care research, but also community care and thinking about prevention. And I think that then takes us back to my point earlier around actually how are they having those community conversations to understand what their research needs are, and then how do they actually address those research needs for their own population. So I see that as being a huge opportunity. We are at NHS England developing guidance to support the emerging ICSs. We're actually working with a number of them because they've reached out to us to say we would like to understand how we should be exercising our duty, and can we support you in terms of looking across the piece and developing guidance for the ICSs, thinking about developing research strategies, etc. So yeah, lots of work to do there, but a huge opportunity, and I think it's something that we need to grasp.
Thank you for that. I'm conscious of the time and the fact we've got to do another topic, before 12:30. So any other very short, snappy contributions, or should we move on? No, well, I'm just going to answer Keith's question. I think doctors have got involved because of culture, practice, kudos, and clinical excellence awards, I have to say. Thank you, everyone, for answering my questions.
Regulators too, I think I've made the point that needs to be addressed. It's getting the permissions to do what Keith says that's very, very hard.
Thank you, Gillian. That was a fascinating discussion. I'm sorry to bring it to a premature halt, but we need to move on to the next topic. So Neelam, can I hand over to you to introduce that topic?
Yes, thank you, James, and thank you, Jill. So the next topic is really about how we can make sure that the UK is at the top of its game in terms of world-class clinical research by having the most effective forms of funding, oversight, and infrastructure for researchers and research organisations. And I'm sad that Martin had to leave, actually, because I think that this would have been a very good topic for him as well. However, I have a couple of questions for the panel, and I'm going to start with the second one, actually, which is very much focusing on the roles of NIHR and UKRI in their roles in providing infrastructure and funding, and how can they be better at doing that in creating a more agile research infrastructure that provides the right levers and incentives for researchers and organisations in the UK. And I'd like to ask that question to the three panellists with their different perspectives. So Chris, you described the large study that you conducted, and it would be great if you could share your experience of the support that you got from bodies such as the NIHR and UKRI, and whether there were exemplars that you can share and any gaps. Nicole, from your perspective, particularly from an HRA point of view, whether you see that there are opportunities for agencies to create much more of an agile research infrastructure. And you've talked already on technology, but whether there's anything else specifically in terms of the infrastructure that we currently have. And I'm sort of also mindful of what Martin had talked about in his session about joining up the various steps in the process. And Lindsey, you shared with us your plans in terms of the AAC and NHS, and it would be great also to get your perspectives on that question as well. So Chris, could I start with you?
Thank you so much. Yes, I mean, there were many amazing things that, you know, make me really proud of UK PLC in the way we did research initially, and the way the system, the NIHR and the NHS sort of stepped up to the plate. And certain key enabling features are that we should really try to preserve. For example, are the nimble peer reviewed funding that was available from the NIHR and UKRI, where we could apply quickly, short turnaround times. You know, it's not the usual 5 years of toing and froing before you got your grant. So that was key. Early interaction between the researchers and the funders and the HRA. So we were able, once we had a indication of funding, to talk to the regulators informally before a final submission to sort things out, so that when proposals for ethics were submitted, there was no surprises there, and we'd work things out. And it was amazing interacting with the same ethics committee, in my case Berkshire, where I could email or phone the chair of the ethics committee to get advice ahead of time, and also talk to colleagues at the MHRA, and that sort of really sped things up a lot. I think the urgent public health status badging was critical, so that the NIHR didn't try and do every single trial that came along, because there were thousands and thousands and thousands of people wanting to do trials. Most of them didn't recruit many patients and just wasted time and resources, whereas badging certain trials as national public health trials meant that resources went to them and people knew that these were the trials to support. So at least we got some answers for some things. And, you can think of REMAP, CAP, Recovery, Principle, and Panoramic as standing out worldwide because of that kind of support. And then, the COVID therapeutics panel assessing what drugs to put in the trials. So we weren't just putting in drugs that happened to be produced by our friends or persuasive colleagues. There was an independent scrutiny about that. So I would say those are the key enabling features. We got better access to data as well, which has changed, and we're losing that, which is a great pity as well. So, but lots to be proud of, so much to try and preserve.
Thank you, Chris. Nicole.
Thank you. So, the first thing I would boldly say that NIHR and UKRI should do is be more aligned, because in my experience, there is, despite the best efforts of the Office for Life Sciences, a diversity in the approaches of UKRI and NIHR. And as NIHR goes forward under new leadership, I think there's a significant opportunity to ensure that we do things once well, that we don't have duplication, and that there's really clear integration between the different parts of government. I think that there's an opportunity for improvement in terms of the two steps. So there's approval processes, and then there's local recruitment. And I think within clinical trials, we need to separate out those things, because we could, as Martin says, have centralized approval, and that would really accelerate processes. So those activities that MHRA does to regulate, those activities that HRA do to ethics approval, and those activities for data approval that hundreds of people do across the NHS and no one knows who even to ask, could really be simplified. So, for example, an expanded HRA could do those data approvals in the same way that it does ethics approvals, very significantly accelerating and removing that burden from very many people across the NHS who will otherwise need to be trained, as the Goldacre review suggests. So how can we help to accelerate those central steps? There's then other steps that need to be taken locally at individual trusts or organisations who are looking to recruit, which would require a different set of solutions. One point on the prioritization, because we talked about this extensively at HRA, during COVID, it was extremely easy to identify those things that we wanted to prioritize. But in the normal run of things, trying to identify things to prioritize is very significantly harder. Do we prioritize cancer? Do we prioritize pediatric diseases? Do we prioritize commercial organizations who are going to invest in the UK and drive growth? So I agree that badging was very helpful, but I don't know quite how we're going to go along with that prioritization in a day-to-day world where we would like to prioritize very many things.
Thank you. Thanks, Nicole. That was really helpful. And so absolutely, in terms of what Chris was saying and the enablers, and I hear you about the prioritization. I think keeping the data access side of things going is really pivotal. But totally hear you in terms of alignment of UKRI and NIHR, and also the efficiency and acceleration between bodies, which I know is occurring. So Lindsey, just over to you. It would be great to hear just your perspective from an NHS and R&D perspective on what would make an agile research infrastructure.
I don't think there's a great deal to add to what the panelists have said. I completely agree in terms of certainly, Chris's point to kind of the agile approach to innovative trial design and really maintaining that and enabling as the systems adapt back into the wider research environment, not just urgent public health environments. How do we maintain that agility, which I think is very difficult? I know NIHR are already responding to the kind of the infrastructure need, looking at their clinical research networks and actually realigning those into more alignment with the NHS geographies. So the new research delivery networks that are out to expressions of interest at the moment. And I think that will make a big difference in terms of the support of research delivery from NIHR across the regions, aligning with both the regions and the ICSs. And I think it comes back to that in terms of making sure that actually the infrastructure is kind of represents and supports the NHS infrastructure as well. So yeah, I don't think there's a huge amount more to say from my perspective on that, other than totally agree with the other panelists.
Thank you. Thanks, Lindsey. I think Corinna is going to go ahead and ask the second question.
So just conscious of time here, we've probably only got about 5 or 10 minutes. So I was just going to ask each of the panelists what specific things they think they could do to bring research into primary, into social care. I think we've talked very generally about clinical research, but really drilling down into sort of 1 or 2 things you'd recommend to bring that kind of real excitement we've seen around clinical research for COVID into primary, and specifically as well into social care, because I think that's an area we sometimes overlook, and Nicole mentioned it earlier, so it came to mind. I think those are 2 areas I'd love to hear a little bit more about. So Nicole, do you want to go first, and then Chris, then Lindsey?
So I think that historically we've thought of research as being the preserve of hospitals. And the fantastic work that Chris was involved in during COVID has shown that really good research can be done in other settings. But also, I think increasingly, as there's pressure on the NHS, we need to look even outside of primary care. Now, for example, dementia research is going to be a massive area of increased focus over the next years, and it's a priority of the life sciences vision. But in fact, many elderly folks are quite easy to access, being in a series of care facilities where there's a real opportunity to use technology, as I mentioned before, to improve the recruitment, to improve the monitoring, and therefore the care on a day-to-day basis before we even get to the research, to create baselines and then to look at how these medicines, how different medicines or interventions work. Clearly, it's important to get the consents right and to do this appropriately and with consideration for people who might be approaching the end of their life. But I think we need to start looking at very different ways of accessing people, and you have to start by going to where the people are. You don't want to necessarily be talking to people who are in hospitals, and very many people, as we know, are not being cared for in hospitals. So I think we need to look at other settings, and we need to look at other organizations, whether it be commercial care homes, whether it be third sector organizations, so Weight Watchers, for example, and work with them to understand their user groups, to involve their user groups in the design, and then to look at a new approach to recruiting, which doesn't put yet more pressure on hospitals who are already, as we know, under significant pressure.
I think, it is in primary care, social care, and indeed in self-care, where research can have the greatest reach and impact. Early treatment of antivirals, for example, for COVID, is the next exciting frontier, but it's, and that might actually be best done in places like care homes and indeed while people are at home. So we shouldn't forget the self-care aspect and involving people directly in research, even if they're not in NHS or health and social care, as it were. And how do we make that easier? And I'll go back to the point about the regulations. The regulations are not fit for purpose for this kind of decentralized, wide reach research, because they are focused on high risk trials that are often done with very, very sick people with dangerous medications. And so the proportionality is completely lost there. And in losing that proportionality, we've tried to recruit care homes many times, often without success, because the contracts and the regulations and the numbers of steps that people have to go through before they can join up. Care home worker now, you show them a contract and, they'll ask about indemnity and so forth. And the care home is a commercial organization usually, and you show them a 20-page contract and they run a mile. They've got already enough problems without getting their lawyers to look at stuff and things like that. So we need to, make contracting a much easier thing, and we need to get the regulation fit for purpose to allow us to include people, particularly in the lower risk, tremendously far-reaching trials much easier, and goes back to the point of making research fun and easy to participate in. So at the moment, everything is there telling people, look, this is dangerous, it's not going to help you, and it frightens people. In one of our PPI groups, there was a person who happened to be Black who said, why are you showing me all this bad stuff? I want to participate. This is all just telling me what's going to go wrong. And, why don't you give us some good news?
Lindsey, final word on expanding our trials beyond secondary care?
So I very much agree with what Nicole was saying about looking kind of to the other organisations that can support research, and not just necessarily healthcare organisations. So how do community groups, voluntary sector organisations actually support this agenda? So really, I think that's a really important thing that we need to explore. And I know I've talked a lot about the ICSs, etc., but it is a real focus of the work that we're doing to help support them, and also understand how we can support them to use those types of networks that are already set up, that they can then tap into and actually start to embed conversations about research within those networks that then would allow the development and delivery of research outside of traditional organisations. I think the other thing for me around this agenda is a patient and public pull. We've talked about ensuring that patients and the public are at the heart of research, and going back to, I think, a point very early made by Chris around actually making sure that research delivered in the place where people actually it's most convenient for them. And I think that principle, if that is a founding principle in terms of the way that research is designed, it will pull research out of secondary care. And then I think the other thing goes back to just making people aware of their the opportunities to participate in research, and we haven't really talked in depth about how we actually support more people to become able to volunteer for research, and what systems are needed for that. And that goes back into kind of how do we use data, how do we support kind of different registries to come together, so that actually people who are already on registries and have volunteered to take part in research can actually view opportunities and make sure that they're aware of how to get involved in research. And there's a lot of work going on with NIHR around their Be Part of Research platform. And we're also looking at, how we can support that through platforms such as the NHS app and also the website nhs.net. So those are the areas I think also that need to be included in these conversations. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Lindsey. I think that's fantastic. I think, there's so much to explore here, from the approvals and the recruitment piece, the kind of structural infrastructure, but then also thinking beyond secondary care. And I think, we could have spent the whole time exploring how do we use those third sector or self-care or community and primary more engagement in research, and then also taking people with us, giving them an easy opportunity and involving them in that. So all of these areas, I think we could have probably spent the entire hour on. But sadly, our time is up, so I will hand back to James. Thank you to all of our panelists.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. I want to, Lindsey, just on that last point, I think I remember back to introducing the national data opt-out, and that was all about trying to persuade people not to do something. It's a huge missed opportunity, actually, not to engage them in a positive conversation about how their data could be used for research. And of course, we now have, as you mentioned, the NHS app as this extraordinary platform on, I forget how many millions, tens of millions of phones it's now on. But we are in everybody's pocket almost, and there is the ability to reach them to have this conversation, which I think is tremendously exciting, to introduce the concept of clinical research to people, actually to solve some of the ethical sort of bureaucracy, if you like, because of that pull from patients. And I'm excited to hear you talking about that. So thank you. I want to give everybody 30 seconds on the one big thing, the big potential recommendation that you would leave us with before we close this first hour. So can I come to Nicole, then Chris and Lindsey, just very briefly, and then we will move on to the second half.
Thank you. Yeah, so I will make a pitch for user-centered design. So bringing the concept of user-centered design, which is second nature in the technology industry, to clinical trials, thinking about how it feels to be a participant, how it feels to be a clinical trialist, involving them at the beginning in the design, means that you then have a process where the friction is reduced. It doesn't mean reducing the methods that you're using. It means changing the process and making sure that you fit it around people. I know that if Martin was here, he would make a pitch for a single central approvals process. So I think I shouldn't stop without mentioning that, because that's what he would be wanting to say at this point. Thank you.
Very good Martin impression as well. Thank you, Nicole. No, Chris, then Lindsey.
Yes, I think we need to get our systems and laws really better attuned to a model whereby we take research to where patients can use it best. So the inverse care law is well known, where the delivery of care or access to healthcare is still inversely proportional to those who need it most. And we formulated, say, an inverse research law, which says that research participation and use of the results of research is inversely proportional to people's access to research. We need to turn that on its head, and we need regulations that are fit for purpose, and that involves contracting, inspections, and regulations around data access. For example, a simple thing, if patients say, you can see all my NHS data, then we should be able to see it. Thank you.
I agree. Thank you. Lindsey.
So 2 points from me. First being a commitment to support making it as easy as we can to undertake research in the NHS, wherever that setting is, and we're very much committed to looking at what are the barriers and where's the duplication of effort, etc., that we can take away. And my second point is about the empowerment of actual people to participate in research, and the empowerment of people to say what research is important to them and what their needs are, and then be able to respond to that.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, a huge thanks to our three panelists in the first half of our four panelists, to Nicole Mather, to Chris Butler, to Lindsey Hughes, and to Martin Landray. That was fascinating, and I think we came up as well with some very big but also implementable ideas, which is precisely what we are after. So thank you all. You are very welcome to stay with us, but you also have busy lives, so equally understand if you need to leave. And I'm now going to hand over to Mike, who is going to lead us through the second half of the session. Mike, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, James, and all the panelists who've contributed, and for all of you that have been putting very interesting stuff on the chat, and please continue to do so. I picked up quite a few things from that, which I'm not going to go through everything because we'll feedback after the recording on this, but it strikes me that from the items you've put down at the end, streamlining, user-centered design, looking at ways of making things simplified and coordinated so that people are not frightened off by research. And I was just going to hark back to when we did the KIO reviews several years ago now, mortality reviews, you might remember. One of the hallmarks of those organizations was their lack of involvement in research networks and their lack of ability to actually contribute. And so I agree with you, Chris, the inverse care law can be applied to research as much as it can to clinical practice and clinical outcomes. We're going to move on now to topics 3 and 4, and I'm pleased to welcome Dean Summerfield, Professor Gary Ford, Dr. Jennifer Harris, and Stuart Carroll to the team. And I hope that we can emulate what has happened before in the first hour, which was exceptionally rich. So I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves and give a 2-minute introduction to their contribution, and then we'll go to Harpreet to go to topic 3. So could I start with Dean first, please?
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity. I lead the real world and commercial solutions business at IQVIA, whom everybody on the show call will be familiar with. And the perspective I'd like to bring into today's discussion are the needs of where clinical trials are moving from the future from the perspective of commercial sponsors of clinical trials. I lead a privileged role of working closely with the hospitals and the research networks that help support commercial clinical trials across the European region. I just want to pick up on a few themes that we talked about earlier today. I think in James' opening comments, he said that unfortunately both the UK and Europe's participation in global clinical commercial trials is declining, and the facts bear us out. And part of the rationale for that is related to 3 factors. Again, things that we've talked about earlier today. One, the first is our speed and quality of research. Compared to when on a globally competitive environment, we need to look at making the changes required to accelerate all the processes to begin and conduct clinical research, building on a lot of themes that were talked about this morning, the regulatory changes, the access to data, the ease of participation in clinical research from the researchers in the NHS. Secondly, we need to, as in the UK, to build on those things which we're really expert at. You know, global clinical trial investment now is dominated by biotech companies. It's not the large companies of the past. And what they're looking for, you know, is that expertise and the advocacy. And the UK stands out globally in a number of dimensions that were borne out in the last couple of years. Our genomics capabilities, our application of real-world data into clinical trials. These are things that the UK leads on, and we need to make more of to, as James said, to start to be that superpower punching at our weight. And the third is those changes to the regulatory side to catalyze clinical trial and innovation, accepting the more modern trial designs and the increased use of different types of evidence and the diversity of clinical care settings. So hopefully in the discussion, I can bring in that perspective both across the region and across the global, what will make the UK more competitive on the global landscape. Thank you, Mike.
And thank you, Dean. And you make a really good point about those new companies that are coming in and getting access. And it's not a traditional type of research company that we're looking at. It's much more modern and much more flexible and perhaps much more nimble, as we've talked about earlier on. Can I come now to Gary Ford, please?
Thanks, Mike. For those who don't know me, I'm a consultant stroke physician and professor of stroke medicine in Oxford. My main role now is as chief exec of an academic health science network, and I'm also current chair of the network, working alongside Richard. And in addition, I'm non-exec director on the board of NICE. So the perspective I'm coming at this is as someone leading an organisation seeking to get more rapid uptake of innovation of high value. In respect of this question, which relates more to the activities prior to things coming over to us, I think the opportunities are really to think through, particularly with digital and diagnostic technologies coming through, how do we move things through to early adoption before we've got a full understanding of their value, because we don't have that when they come to market, and we won't. And so I think schemes like the early value assessment framework that NICE are introducing, frameworks for real world evaluation as technologies are introduced, without the level of evidence you would have, for example, with drug therapies, offer a real opportunity to get early data and optimize the technology in terms of thinking about clinical pathways. The other general point I would make is most of the framing of development of technologies and new therapies still focuses around single disease conditions. I mean, I still spend my time in that respect, in that framework, working on stroke, for example. But that doesn't align with the needs of the NHS and indeed other healthcare systems in terms of their priorities. So in 2019, when USN Network and NIHR did a review of research and innovation needs of the NHS, unsurprisingly, the top problem they were looking for solutions for was workforce. And behind that was mental health, particularly in children, then the management of people with multiple long-term conditions and frailty, and then also how to best use technology to improve patient self-management and to improve, again, workforce productivity. These need to be brought in much earlier into the development of frameworks and also be thought about in terms of the outcomes, particularly by the HTA groups. But what we find is we have technologies coming through with good technical performance, but really insufficient data of understanding how they will impact and give value to the system. And we can maybe elaborate on.
Thank you very much, Gary. You make an important point about complexity and how we actually link research into that. Jennifer Harris from ABPI now, can I come to you?
Thank you, Michael, and thank you everybody for inviting me to speak at this session. Apologies if my voice is a bit croaky, I'm just getting over the cold. So as Michael said, I'm Dr. Jennifer Harris. I'm the Director of Research at the ABPI, and I'm going to be bringing a pharmaceutical industry R&D perspective to this session. The ABPI PwC report that was published at our annual conference earlier this year really outlines how the UK can become a global leading hub in life sciences. And it stresses that the UK needs a really strong end-to-end life sciences ecosystem if it's to grow the sector and attract further investment. And clinical trials and our underpinning regulatory framework are really key to that. However, the UK is becoming a less attractive environment in this regard. James outlined, briefly touched on the kind of declining trends at the front of the call. And just to give a flavour of that, NIHR data shows that patient access to industry clinical trials and the treatments that come with them has fallen dramatically over recent years. In 2021-22, we had only 28,000 participants going into industry trials, and that was a fall of around 3-4% down from 2017-2018. So only around 2% of the recruits going into the NIHR CRN's portfolio is currently going into innovative, cutting-edge industry clinical trials. And on top of that, the trials that are on the portfolio, almost half of them are failing to meet their recruitment targets, which, as we know, for global timelines is incredibly important in making sure that we are delivering those opportunities for patients. So altogether, that's really contributing to poorer health outcomes and health inequalities in the UK. In our annual clinical research reports, we've kind of reviewed that problem, I suppose, and looked at the key pillars that we need to improve going forward. And picking up on the comments from the last session, we absolutely need to be embedding clinical research in healthcare, to Lindsey's points. We need to reform and streamline not just approvals of clinical trials, but the setup of studies, as Martin was alluding to. We need to increase and diversify patient recruitment to clinical trials and adopt innovative clinical trial design and delivery approaches, which I think speaks a bit more to the kind of the regulatory side of this session. And we need to ensure that we're really reporting on all of that as well, so we've got a good sense of how we're performing. If you then marry that with a really attractive access and uptake environment, you have that end-to-end ecosystem that's globally competitive. So we need to be working across all fronts there. And I think that what's in the life sciences vision really lays that out. And actually now we need to focus on implementation of that, because it's something the sector's already behind. And finally, in terms of what the prize is at the end of the road, if we were to line that stuff up and get all of those components right, the ABPI PwC report estimates that the UK would gain an additional 68 billion in GDP over the next 3 decades, resulting from increased R&D investment. And we'd see a 40% decrease in total attributable burden of disease. So the prize is really clear, not only for the wealth of the nation, but the health of the nation as well. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Jennifer. Growth seems to be the word of the week. So I guess you've just given 68 billion to the economy if we get this right. So there'll be some people higher above us all that are looking forward to that contribution, should we get the right tools in place to do so. Can I come now to Stuart Carroll, please?
Thank you very much. I'm Stuart Carroll, Director of Market Access Policy Affairs for Moderna UK and Ireland. Also, prior to that, I was working on the Vaccines Task Force and the Antivirals Task Force in government, and would just like to bring out some of the insights I got from that role. I want to just quickly focus on 3 key areas which I think relate to these topics, and that is horizon scanning, data expertise, and different ways of working. So when we think about how can we get different bodies to work better together and more closely together, I think horizon scanning in the UK, in terms of what's coming through the industry pipeline, does need to be significantly enhanced. In the pharmaceutical space, we do have a pretty good system through PharmaScan, but that system is largely designed for more traditional technologies. It's not designed for newer, more innovative technologies. If you take, for example, Moderna and the use of our mRNA scientific platform, we're going to be moving that into all sorts of new areas. And one thing I really want to point out is if you look at the vaccine space, the horizon scanning process is somewhat regressive and outdated. It's effectively a form that you're asked to fill in, detailing clinical trials over the next 5 years. That form's actually in a Word 1997 document, which is nostalgic, but not exactly indicative of progression in the future. And there isn't really a forum outside of meetings with what's now the UK Health Security Agency and the JCVI Secretariat to bring together different actors into one room, one setting, to talk about what's in that pipeline and the specifics of it in terms of the type of technology and the type of science. And that is really, really important, not least for the MHRA phase and the regulatory step. And there is a need, I think, for a significant change to how that step is done. That does link to the second point around data and expertise. We have to ensure that those who are on the regulatory side or within a HTA body are being continually upskilled and trained on the science and technologies and innovations of the future. And that's something actually that I think can be hit a bit more over the net back to the industry to say, well, you need to come to us more and explain what it is exactly you're working on within your pipelines, and does that fit with the NHS's ultimate strategy? That is a clear link with horizon scanning, but that can only be done well if you're having the same conversation and you're working from the same page. And data, it's been touched upon throughout the conversation already, but we do, I think, need to start embracing the use of real world data, real world evidence a lot more. That is critical for population interventions like vaccination, because of course we are having to take clinical trials and then move them into a real world setting across millions and millions of people. And in order to better optimize and hone recommendation decisions as to where those vaccines should be prioritized, the use of real world evidence is key. But also when you're looking at a preventative model, which is the critical, I think, reality that we need to properly embrace, move away from this national illness service to a genuine national health service, that also requires a different methodological approach. We heard about Bayesian methods earlier. We need to embrace the use of extrapolation, interpolation a lot more, and we need to have a much better approach to how do we define risk and uncertainty and how we roll with that and how we partner on that between the industry and the healthcare system. Just quickly, I'd like to touch upon different ways of working. It does relate a little bit to the previous topic, but I think there's a need to look fundamentally differently at how we do, for example, clinical trials. So there's less burden on staff. It's easier for participants to play an active role. So we do need to look at digital tools, automation. We are still pretty analog, even though we're allegedly in a digital world. Certainly in the health sector, I don't think we're as advanced as other sectors where there's a lot of digitalization ongoing and occurring. And also, I think when you look at UKRI, MRC, NIHR, we need to recognise that, you know, a broken NHS hurts clinical research. So we need to stop trying to fight for scarce resources all the time, and we need to actually mobilise life sciences. That's an industry imperative as much as a government imperative. And one political thing that I think is key, which I know a House of Lords committee has asked for, and I think it is important, I think we need a cabinet minister for science. We need to have a person who has an overarching responsibility, accountability for life sciences. It can't keep just being pushed under the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care. It's got to be brought out into its own world. That's critical for the economy, but it's also critical for the future of healthcare.
Thanks, Stuart. You sort of give James a challenge there, I think, but you can come at the end about that one, James, if you don't mind. But what you're saying is there needs to be better alignment between the understanding of how we're using data, better alignment in how we're doing trial design, etc. As that's not there in your view.
Exactly right. I think what I've seen is that if there isn't that alignment, you can have unnecessary delays. And we have to remember that when you're in an industry situation, a CEO is having to make big decisions about huge budgets under shareholder pressure very quickly. And every time the UK is slow, the opportunity cost is big. That effectively means it's going to go somewhere else. So, you know, the UK, for all of its strengths around having strong academic institutions, a strong life sciences base in many ways, I think we also have to get real about where we are genuinely world leading and where frankly we're mid-table or in the relegation zone. We're not in the Champions League positions in everything, and I think we need to be a bit blunter about that. And when it comes to timings and comes to pace, you know, I think generously I'd say we're mid-table, but we're maybe a bit further down the league table if I'm being really frank.
Okay, we'll see if we can do something about that, Stuart, today. Harpreet, I'm going to hand over to you now to introduce topic 3 and ask some the questions around that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you to all the panelists joining for this session. So I wanted to pick up on the theme of growth, but actually change it towards thinking about collaboration. And obviously, we've seen collaboration play a really useful, important role over the last kind of 2.5 years during the pandemic, and in some extent continues to do so. So for me, it's about understanding, well, you know, agencies collaborating and how they've demonstrated, you know, streamlining that UK can be a place where we can review and improve technologies effectively and very quickly. But I guess for us now, as we look ahead, the UK really needs to think about what steps do we need to take to ensure that the same practice continues for future innovations, particularly given the rising number of technology submissions that we're seeing. So my first question, and if I may open up to Jennifer, which is, you know, what practical changes should the MHRA, HRA, and HCA bodies implement to ensure that we have streamlined close working between all bodies?
Thanks, Harpreet. So absolutely, we've seen some fantastic ways of working during the pandemic, and even beyond that, obviously the success and interest in the innovative licensing and access pathway, which I think, having been to some of the global regulatory conferences this year, ILAP really does look like the kind of flagship program from the UK at the moment that's pushing boundaries, which is good. I think in terms of the kind of clinical trial regulation space and the importance of having a kind of streamlined end-to-end piece there in order to then kind of feed into the marketing authorization and licensing end, We're already seeing combined review from MHRA and HRA for CTIMPs being rolled out this year for CTIMPs from the 1st of January, which has brought our approvals for clinical trials down to 60 days. Now that brings us in line with European standards in terms of what's issued within the EU CTR. But the challenge we then face is that the regulatory frameworks around how studies are then set up within the NHS is then letting us down. And we've then got studies that are set up for 180 days plus. So given countries like Spain have got studies set up within the NHS where regulatory processes such as the costing and contracting of commercial studies is done in parallel with our regulatory and ethics approvals, they are already getting that kind of end-to-end piece done within 60 days, and we're just getting half of that done in 60 days. So really, it's good that we've moved in that direction, but there's a lot more we could be doing with getting those timelines tightened up and getting those processes streamlined. In terms of the piece around, I think, connectivity with the other agencies, I've mentioned ILAP. It's obviously received over 100 odd applications since its launch. I think the feedback that we get from members is that there's a lot more potential within the ILAP piece, such as bolstering the toolkit that sits alongside that in areas such as kind of surrogate and novel endpoints, innovative trial design, which we've mentioned today, and making sure that that early dialogue is established with both the regulators and the HTA agencies early on, so that we're generating evidence that not only gets you the marketing authorization, but then can carry you through that HTA piece. It's obviously a challenge. Both sides look at slightly different things, but I think the potential in ILAP is really there to do that. And in terms of Stuart's points around novel technologies, there's real potential there to bring that into the fold in the ILAP piece as well. And then finally, I know that we mentioned the UK CTR coming into force in Europe and therefore opportunity for what we can do here in the UK. I think we were really encouraged to see some of the proposals in that CTR from the MHRA being potentially even more world-leading than what's already established. In some of the proposals in areas such as reform and manufacturing and labelling requirements and transparency and GCP, members felt that was taking us in the right direction in terms of global competitiveness. And if we can actually enforce that CTR in the UK, I know it's we're waiting for the government response at the moment, I think that will put us in a good position going forward. And by putting more things in guidance rather than hardline legislation, I think that gives us the agility, to Stuart's point, as innovation comes up, we can adjust and flex to that and respond to that accordingly. So I think I'll leave it there. Stuart mentioned RWE and RWD, but I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Jennifer. And Stuart, obviously, clearly Jennifer's teed you up very nicely, which I wanted to just get from you with the industry perspective. I mean, do you see any practical changes that MHRA, HRA, and HTA, can implement to ensure that we have that streamline working together?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo what's just been said. I think that's absolutely right. I do think, like I said, a key bit of this is the horizon scanning phase going in, because if you can get good alignment with the relevant bodies early on, and also that's an education mechanism, because in the first instance, it will, of course, more often than not be the manufacturer has the greatest understanding of the asset, the compound that's coming through. And as we start to look at more innovative technologies, more innovative scientific platforms, the need for that early dialogue, I think, is really, really important. But I think also, the use of some of the more latent NHS data wherever possible, and having MHRA, considering real-world data where appropriate to supplement clinical trials is something that I do think needs to be part of the mix and the equation. One of the great learnings from, I think, the early bits of the pandemic, although yes, it was done under Regulation 174s and emergency approvals, there was a blueprint of sorts of how you can bring these different stakeholders together quickly. Now, of course, that was within a particular context, and I appreciate the world has moved on, but there are lessons there which we should learn, and there are elements to that which we should seek to retain in terms of how that system can work moving forward.
Wonderful. Gillian, you have your hand up, and then Dean.
Yeah, thanks. Just quickly on this streamlining working together piece. It's often just about people, isn't it? People working together better, collaborating better, which we did stupendously well in the pandemic. But I wondered if anyone felt there were really hard barriers to doing this efficiently and effectively, you know, be that organizational boundaries, confidentiality agreements around sharing data, fiscal requirements, regulation. You know, are there any hard barriers is an important question.
Great, thank you, Julian. Dean, you have your hand up. Would you want to take part of that, or did you want to come in on previous point?
Well, I think maybe I'll address part of that and also comment on the other pieces. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the development now, a lot of people making clinical trial investments globally don't have presences in the UK. They're the biotech companies funded by VCs and PEs. And so whilst I fundamentally agree with everything Jennifer and Stuart said, it's still a really complex system for the outsider. If you're a biotech company sitting in South Asia, China, the US, and you're trying to work your way through. So I think part of, to Gillian's answer, is the fragmentation of the applications you need to make is a barrier. Because if it's hard for us, for a company that's looking globally to apply, the UK, if it's slow, to Stuart's point, and if it's slow in making that connection, not just through the regulatory process and the trial, but also driving approval through NICE or any other HTA body, and then commercial uptake, they're not going to put their investment dollars here versus elsewhere. So I think we do need to look at the fragmentation of decision making, and also you put some information in for one body, and then frankly, honestly, you need to retype it in another. And that burden it's fine if you're a large pharmaceutical company with a presence in the country. If you're not, then is it worth it versus going to Spain, as in Jennifer's example, or another country who have addressed to do these things in parallel, share the information, and just make life easier, you know, to go through the processes.
Absolutely, and part of this is how do we develop a trusted working relationship between the organizations, which is great. Thank you. Gary, did you want to come on this point, and then I'll move on to question 2?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point being made about close working between HRA and MHRA is key. I think particularly for digital and diagnostic technologies, and it links to the earlier point about what information do we need to be able to give a positive recommendation, and more importantly, that the NHS will then adopt it because it considers to be high value. And that then reads across to how much do you need in formal randomized trials or other formalized research evaluation? What can you do in real world service evaluation that is convincing data? And these worlds kind of exist separately at the moment. And the NHS itself doesn't make an integrated offer. And you've got the different parts competing to say, we can do this for you. But it relates to Dean's point. We need a more integrated offer. How do you get the whole data in a timely way, running in parallel from both research and real-world evaluation that gives you that persuasive information to understand value, which will then drive adoption? And I think we still haven't optimized that, and there's an opportunity to do that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Gary. Stuart, let me ask point 2, unless you wanted to come on this quickly.
Just very quickly, I just wanted to kind of answer Jill's point direct. I think on the data protection confidentiality side, we're pretty good. I actually think this is a bigger problem. We have to go up a level. So 2 quick points. 1, if you're a CEO, you come to your UK team and say, well, how do I get, you know, through the regulation, through access to reimbursement? And if you think about it, you say, well, we've got to look at clinical trials, go through MHRA, then go through NICE, if it's that side, or JCVI, depending on the intervention in question. Then you might have to go through an NHS England budget test. Then you've got to look at 4 devolved nations. Then you've got to look at implement. And then before you can even get to the end of the sentence, he's looking at you or she's looking at you going, right, okay, in this country, it's basically A to B. So we do need to recognise that point. That puts people off pretty quickly. And the second point is that I think we need to also face up to the fact that, you know, we need to reimagine Whitehall here quite a bit, because when I was in government, you know, the modus operandi around risk uncertainty was, if in doubt, escalate. If in doubt, write a sub to a minister that's 500 pages with 20 appendices. If possible, pass it to someone else. I could go on and on and on. Well, you know, that's not really in line with innovation. You know, that's not really in line with embracing the things we're talking about. So I think we've got to recognise there's a bigger Whitehall issue here.
Yeah, no, thank you, Stuart. They're really, really helpful. Okay, good. So, and then question to, and Gary, if I start with you on this one particularly, I mean, how do we think then, based on some conversation we're having, and we've kind of touched upon some of this, is how can MHRA and HTA in particular be better supported to manage the increasing volume of market authorizations submissions that we're getting? Any views on that?
Well, it's certainly a challenge, and I think what we're at risk of generating here is a lot of positive approvals on basis of clinical effectiveness, but not clear demonstration of cost effectiveness with an NHS that's got some tough choices to make. And the question is, how are we going to bite the bullet on that? Now, you can either start to say, well, because of the contribution to economic growth, if we have early adoption, if we think those follow, we're going to have protected resources and funding, which we're doing to some extent, with certain disease areas and with severity modifier, for example, in our value health economic valuations. But I think we are going to come up against a tough challenge of making choices when, at the local level, new therapies for rare diseases are not going to, in no way, going to be seen as a priority by integrated care systems, whether we like that or not. I think we've got to accompany this with a really well thought through program of, for example, early diagnostics for cancer that shift the whole value that is then very clear. If we can, obviously, a lot more value if you can prevent cancers rather than treating them at the late stage. And there's very promising work in that area. But there's no simple answer to this. You either, I think the other opportunity we've got, which we're seeing, is the national agreements you can put in place for early access with data generation and some of the emerging deals that are being thought about that give high value products, albeit they are in terms of their clinical outcome. We get them at a much lower acquisition price than other countries. I mean, we already get our drug therapies at one of the lowest prices compared to other countries. So I think we're going to have to explore that, and that is being explored. And for us, I think that's really interesting to get in early on with some of the new therapies, which are what we would call potentially disruptive to pathways. So, we've got examples with inclisiran, we've got long-acting blood pressure drugs doing, and I think there's a lot of lessons we can learn from the early experience of that, of how you introduce those early into the system. My own view is, as an NHSM, we would say you need some early adopting pilot sites to shape it rather than going for national everywhere. And often we have a rather simplistic, almost morally driven thing. If we introduce a new therapy, everybody's got to get it straight away. And we'll come on to that maybe in the next question. Well, the reality is that is not how innovation spreads and how you get the best value from it. So some tough questions, but I think we do have a real opportunity in the NHS to be seen as a valuable system.
Brilliant. Thank you, Gary. Sure. Then Jenny or Dean, did you want to come in on that?
A couple of questions building what Gary's comments building Gary's. If we look, I think we've got to look at, and it's come up already today, we need to look at where research is going in terms of the clinical development pipeline. And we have systems that are set up for product approvals, perhaps of the past. And we've struggled in the UK to adopt to precision oncology. And then we look at the future right now. We've got these very advanced disruptive therapies that Gary's just mentioned, whether in cell and gene, etc., which are going to be expensive. There's no point avoiding that they're going to be expensive. And we have a chance, and inclisiran is a great initial example, to think in the UK of how we can have early dialogue about new funding mechanisms, new approaches, build that spread of innovation in a different way that Gary's talking about, and set the, as we have done in this area of cost effectiveness and meeting the challenges in a different way in the UK. We have a history of that, but perhaps we're falling behind. So that's one area we're looking at different approaches across MHR and particularly the HTA bodies. But then we've got the other next bolus. The second biggest area of research, it was mentioned earlier, is in CNS, it's in Alzheimer's. And then the savings aren't going to be in, if we look at purely the system set up on the drugs budget and how we spread that 10, 11%, and yet the real savings of this are going to go across the total health and social care budget. So we're looking just to maximize the collaboration in HTA and MHRA, focus on the drug cost, rather on how we save money in provision of health and population health gain. Then I think we're missing the trick. And again, we're going to be a slow adopter of the great innovation that's coming through in the neurological, whether that's in Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, or in the rare conditions where there's desperate need for patients to have improvement. We've done it in the past, getting them working together. We can do it again in the future, and nobody solved it yet, so we can be world leading in this.
Wonderful, thank you. Great. Okay, well, let me then get on to the final question, which will allow us to bring some of this together, especially if we look at how we become international competitors. If I can start with Stuart on this one, which is, what new approaches should the UK regulatory and HTA bodies then explore and support in the UK becoming increasingly internationally competitive as a market of choice in providing patients with equitable access to, as we discussed, groundbreaking treatments?
Yeah. So I've kind of focused on two things here. On the regulatory side, I think the increasing use of real-world evidence data to supplement decisions, I think, is important. There's no escaping the fact clinical trials are key and the bedrock to looking at safety, efficacy, quality, but we have to, I think, extend and extrapolate beyond that in order to ensure that regulatory decisions are accounting for the real world, particularly population-based interventions, because by definition we're looking at relatively small sample sizes to make those decisions when we could be utilizing through fairly sophisticated methodologies, whether that be Bayesian applications or meta-analyses, indirect comparisons to support some of that decision making. I think on the HTA side, what Dean just said around the pricing models is vital. We still have a pretty flat approach, to how pricing's done. Other countries have become more innovative in that regard. I don't think any country's doing it to a particularly high standard, just to say. I think it's a low bar everywhere, but we have remained flat. And I do think we need to look at the health economic side. I'm a health economist, epidemiologist by background, and the HTA process, if you go back 1999 onwards, it's sort of just continually morphed with kind of complexity. It's got even bigger, it's like a big machine, and I think we have to try and cut through some of that. That's not to say that cost effectiveness isn't an important hurdle, of course it is, but one elephant in the room is pretty much using the same threshold, 20 to 30,000 pounds per quality. And we've had financial crises, energy crises, wars, all sorts, and we're increasing in real terms the NHS budget. There's something not quite aligned there. So I think we have to look at those elements and say, are we actually being competitive here about what we want and where we're deciding to put our money? And the final thing I'll say is that yes, there needs to be high HTA scrutiny, but the only way the sacred institution which we all value so much, the NHS, is going to sustain is if we keep people out of hospital and stop people using it. That does mean better use of drugs, better use of vaccines, better use of medical clinical interventions. And it feels like more often not what we're trying to do through VPAS and other schemes is hammer that down whilst we just let other bits of the budget go elsewhere. And I think that's perverse.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's very, very helpful. Jennifer, did you have anything to add to that?
Just two really quick things, because I'm conscious of time. One is around just saying that in terms of clinical trials and access and uptake, we're out mid-pack for access and uptake, and certainly very low down when it comes to phase 3 clinical trials. So we really need to keep an eye on how the regulatory environment moves going forward and how that reflects in our global rankings. I think there's two things. One is making sure that we don't let under-resourcing and underfunding of our regulatory agencies result in a drop down of our regulatory ability to put capability and kind of world-leading reputation post-pandemic. We've obviously seen the MHRA reorg this year, and we need to ensure that going forward, whatever infrastructure and organisational framework that they have, that is still delivering on the services that we need. And the second thing as part of that is then making sure that if we are going to be a bit more forward thinking, we do have new innovations and patient pathways up the line, that we then have the skilled regulatory capacity and capability to really be able to do that justice.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you all for that. I think there's quite a lot of very, very useful insights which we'll capture, and I think important that we place that in a way that allows us to become more competitive, but think about how we are more collaborative. Let me now hand over to Richard on topic 4. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So we're approaching the end of the session, and thank you for your comments so far. We've talked a lot about the ambition of industry and how it is or isn't met by the public sector. But I think for topic 4, we're going to just drill down a little bit more into that area. So my question is really about the UK needs to match the ambition of industry and the growing number of submissions for innovative technologies each year by ensuring that solutions are adopted within the health system, where an improvement to patient outcomes or reduction in health inequalities can be realised. Of course, the very point of this. So, question 1, and I think Gary, I'll come to you first. What policies or levers are required at a national and/or local level to ensure that technologies, once approved for use, are adopted quickly and easily within the NHS?
So I think the first thing is, it goes back to an earlier comment, the value proposition has got to be clear. So let's assume we've got that. And yes. I think the previous conversations about taking account of wider benefits, such as impact on workforce, productivity in the NHS, if it takes less professional time to do something, that is of huge value at the current time. And also similarly, patient self-management of new technologies offer massive advantages, and these are often not always captured properly. So what helps get new technologies in is when you've got a clear national framework and strategy in place for the clinical area those are relevant to, and you've got a clear implementation structure and set of incentives around it. And we do have examples where we had massive change in the positive change in NHS services in the 2000s when we had the cancer, stroke, cardiac strategies, and we had the cardiac networks in place. Now, we sit as a more generic implementation structure as HSNs, but what we often find is that clear policy nationally is not available, and more importantly, we then also don't have good data easily accessible to be able to understand uptake and look at variation. And that isn't, so we've got to optimize the use of any national databases that are available. And previous discussion talked about the clunkiness of getting and delays in getting access to that, to use it to drive early adoption. You do need to have clear financial and incentive levers in place, but they're often overemphasized in their importance, and when you remove them, it often reveals other barriers which are more fundamental, such as clinicians' opposition to the new way of working. And so if you look at some of the new technologies coming through, we see in AI interpretation of brain imaging, strong opposition from some of the neuroradiology community, because they're comparing the performance to themselves, and that's not relevant because they're not sitting there interpreting brain scans in the middle of the night in a district general hospital. And when we've looked at AI algorithms for looking for skin cancer, strong opposition from the dermatology community, again, because they're comparing it to themselves, they're expecting these technologies to perform better. And so there is a hearts and minds issue and just addressing those cultural barriers very early on. So there's no simple answer, but it's not just financial levers. What we've learned, through inclisiran, through looking at in great detail, is some of the local barriers to adoption that can be put in place with NICE guidance. Why do we have local formulary committees deciding whether a NICE therapy goes on for use when NICE has already made a decision? And that drives post-growth prescribing and inequalities, and we've not grasped that, I don't think. I think we are getting a much better understanding, and we are working as an NHS network with Innovation Research Life Science team to think more clearly about the conceptual model and framework in how you introduce innovation that goes beyond, we've got a great new product that's going to improve clinical outcomes. So I'm positive we're moving in the right direction, but we need to do a lot more work, a lot more rapidly. And I will say there's not enough focus on this bit or enough funding compared to the funding in the research infrastructure.
Thank you, Gary. I would obviously agree with that. I'm going to come on to Dean and then Jennifer and Stuart for the same question. But I guess what Gary's done there, I think, he's highlighted some of the existing levers and policies that are in place, and also I think alluded to some others that could be enhanced, such as do it once through night, etc. I'm wondering, Stuart, I'll come to you first. Is there anything radical that we need to think about in terms of either levers or policies that, I've been, as many of us have, in this area for a number of years now. We've tried quite a lot of levers to pull. What have we not done yet that we should be thinking about either nationally or locally?
So I think Gary nailed it really there with the overview. I think one of the biggest ones, the complicated thing is keeping it simple. And as I was saying before, if you're speaking to your CEO and you start explaining the regulatory access path, and I didn't finish the sentence earlier, but you add at the end of it, well, then we've got this sort of local access hurdle, which is drug and formulary committees, and people are like, well, why have you got that? You've got through NICE, you've got through NHS England. So it is actually probably a radical suggestion, but it's a simple suggestion. I think they can just be removed. If you've got a NICE recommendation, it should go through, and through the new bigger structure, each chief executive should be held firmly to account to ensure that that is a priority on the dashboard, and that is always green. And if it's not green, NHS England need to step in and treat that as a special case. If it's of a significant variety, there has to be an accountability mechanism here, because in the end, otherwise you're going to have one patient getting access, which, as we know, could save their life, and another doesn't. I mean, this is not trivial stuff we're talking about. It's profound and it's significant. The other thing I would mention, to come back to the vaccination space, is we need to absolutely ensure we have the right workforce and enough of the workforce. We need enough vaccinators. And of course, with the pressure on primary care, dealing with COVID backlogs and everything else, we need to absolutely ensure that the routine immunisation schedule, which has been deprioritised because of COVID, is reprioritised. And that's a workforce issue as well as an implementation issue. But we do need to not forget that imperative, because that's something we have done extremely well as a country. We are world leading in that space, but we do need to, I think, make sure that we don't forget that imperative.
Yeah. Thanks, Stuart. And Jennifer, I can come to you and then we'll come to Dean.
Thanks, Richard. Obviously echo the comments that Gary and Stuart have said. I think one of the key things, if we just look at some of the points around variation, I mean, CR UK found that cancer patients in West London were 71% more likely to be asked about opportunities to participate in research than cancer patients in Cheshire and Merseyside. And when we're engaging on things like genomics, ATMP uptake, we see similar trends in the sense that there's huge variation in those things. Now, I acknowledge Gary's point that we can't do everything everywhere, but I would be surprised that if you overlaid some of these deficiencies, whether or not you'd get similar kind of bright spots and dark spots, so to speak. And it may be the case that there's specific initiatives and incentives that can actually kill multiple birds with one stone, so to speak. So I think some of these things line up in terms of research activity, uptake and access to innovation, genomic testing, etc. And one of the things that we've heard really loud and clear, even though it's perhaps not so radical, but I think is really, really crucial, is that when we speak to healthcare professionals in the system, the awareness, training and education around some of these things is just really lacking. But at the same time, they don't have the time. I mean, the elephant in the room is the lack of resource and the massive staff vacancies. So we have to find a way of carving time for people to be up to speed with these things so that they know what the pathways are and what the levers are. And if those pathways are then made a bit more streamlined and easier to navigate, then actually you might have some of those boundaries taken down as well. So perhaps less radical, but definitely fundamental. Richard.
No, thank you, Jennifer. And Dean.
Yeah, I agree with all that's been said. Maybe give an additional perspective. this separation that we persist between research, pricing approval and clinical care is so outdated. We said earlier in the inquiry that we have to see research as part of the continuum. We'll give you a practical example. Approaching half of all the projects in development today have some kind of stratification of biomarker. In the research setting, we can throw extra resources, we get people to work together, we can physically connect, because we put extra money in the genomic data with the biomarker data, with the path data into the clinical record. It's done manually, effectively. And that really inhibits uptake. I spoke to a chief executive of several of the London hospitals a couple of years ago, and he expressed immense frustration that they developed these products on the leading edge, and when launched, the uptake in the same hospitals to the patients is minimal. So I'll give you two examples around the world where things are being done differently in this space. Lots of hospitals around Europe now are doing routine consent of a patient when they take a biosample for reconsent and reanalysis and retesting that sample for clinical trials. So they explain the requirements, they put it in the biobank, and they say, if a new trial comes along, we'll look at your data, we'll test the sample against a biomarker that wasn't known before. And if you're eligible and you're still at the right stage of your disease, we can go back and recontact you to see if you would be interested in the trial. So they're building up that repository of information. We're throwing it away, it's disconnected. If you take Norway, for example, in their national genomics program, because as they collect the information, they are systematically looking whether there are trial opportunities. They're now getting 50% of their metastatic cancer patients in clinical trials. And Jennifer can probably give us a statistic. I mean, it's a fraction of that here because they're connecting these programs, clinical care and research on a regular basis. And whether it's a policy, it's a behavior, those are the kinds of things that make a real difference to care, but also back the attractiveness and the speed at which clinical research can be conducted in the UK.
Thank you, Dean. I'm just going to bring Gary back in because he's got his hand up there.
Yeah, just to build on Dean's comments there, which I completely agree with. We've got this separation, both in regulatory terms and approval, which one can understand, between research and adoption implementation. And they're just not joined up at all. They're completely separated in the NHS, and the research community sees implementation as being a good thing, but not its responsibility. So if you take an example, the idea of the clinician scientist is now very well accepted as being of value in science. The people who are doing clinical care actually understand the basic science, and they act as bridge people, and you drive translational medicine through that. And we need the clinical researcher adopter being much more valued. And they are fewer and far between because universities don't value that activity apart from the occasional impact statement. We're making some progress in moving towards that. But those skill sets are different, and they need to be supported. And we need to be thinking about who's going to move this technology, who is the interface people who have got that understanding of how this will land as they're doing the research, and then will help work with the system to drive it. And we need that also the managerial level as well, to avoid the frustration that the chief executive Dean referred to.
Thanks, Gary. Mike?
Just to say, Richard, we've got about 5 minutes left, and I'd quite like to get some summing up soon. So I just wonder whether we could go to the next question and then.
Yes, thanks. No, thank you for that prompt. And I was going to say to the panel, sadly, we are running out of time. So I'm going to give them the next question, but just ask for some very, very short reflections, I think. We've talked a lot about variation between ICSs and national or local levers to maybe try and smooth that out. But I think the second question really refers to variation within a patch. So how can ICSs help to eliminate variation in the adoption of approved innovative technologies across their patch? We've talked obviously a lot about mandation. So I think we'll put that to one side for now. So I guess any further reflections on eliminating the postcode lottery that Gary's referenced? And again, I'll start with Gary, but just some very quick 30-second reflections, please.
Yeah, so within a patch, I think the key thing is creating communities of practice, clinical networks, where you bring people together and they look, you give them the data on the variation, and you say, this is the variation, why? And there may be good reasons, there may be bad reasons. People change their behavior on the basis of what they see their peers doing. And that's probably the biggest thing that ICSs can do, and they're not doing enough of that, in my view.
Thank you, Gary. Jennifer.
Yeah, just to build on that, I think we saw a really good example in Birmingham during the pandemic, where within their region they had real-time data coming in about where the patients were with what, and being able to then act responsively in terms of bringing them into trials. We had great data coming out of the things like recovery that were informing healthcare practice, and that connectivity and agility within the ecosystem I think is really important. So Gary's absolutely right, and I think data and evidence is going to be key to that. Do we have the right tools and surveillance to understand where the dark spots are and the bright spots are, and then flex and move accordingly within that network to really achieve the change that we need.
Thank you, Jennifer. Stuart?
Yeah, I agree with what both Jennifer and Gary said. Just one thing I think innovatively that should be considered here, government talks about level up as one of its principal objectives. Level up isn't just the economy, it is also health. You look at the north versus the south, life expectancy, very different. And I'm not just saying this as someone biased from Newcastle originally. That is a moral, ethical disgrace, and I think there should be a level up fund, not just for building a new train station in Bradford and other areas, which is great. It should also be focusing on healthcare, because there is a massive disparity there.
Thank you, Stuart. Although Bradford does need a train station, I'll just add that now. And Dean?
I do agree with that, yeah.
Look, all of that, everybody wants to make the right decision for the patients they treated. If they're not, it's because they're not aware of the benefit of the new therapy, or they're not seeing the impact it can have. So I just echo the points that have been made. Provide them the information in the real time, facilitate that dialogue, and they'll move to it. If it's better for the patients, they make the decision. They're only not making that decision because they just don't know. They're not being trained. They're not seeing the hard facts and figures in clinical practice. And that's what the ICS can facilitate.
Thanks, team. Gary, I'm afraid we've run out of time, I'm afraid, but thank you, panel, for that short reflections. Mike, over to you to close.
Thank you very much, and thanks everybody for their contribution today. I am going to ask the four panelists just to give me a pithy one-liner about their recommendations, if they can at all do that. Jennifer, I'm going to come to you first, as you were smiling.
Yes. So I think, given this session is based more on regulation, I think I'd push for regulatory reform via the introduction of the UK CTR, streamlined industry study setup processes, and that greater cross-agency working via ILAP and the Early Scientific Advice Service. Pithy enough, I hope, Michael.
It was very pithy. Thank you. Stuart?
I would say horizon scanning. We need it earlier, better joint working there, better education, to really ensure that those different parts of the system come together quickly, and that we use data wherever it is, particularly real world evidence data, latent NHS data, as part of every single phase of that process.
Thank you. And Gary?
Be clear about the wider benefits of technologies beyond the pure clinical outcome, and then design your studies and your real world data collection to be able to show that value and impact, which will then drive adoption.
And finally, Dean?
Let's bring our research and clinical practice worlds together and think about where clinical research or new products are looking. So the reuse of data, the smoothing of processes that have been talked about. Let's just look at it as a continuum and stop compartmentalizing it, and because that fragmentation we have makes us globally uncompetitive.
Thank you. This is a third of our 4 commissions, and thank you very, very much for all of your contributions today. It has been as rich as the previous 2. And James, I don't know whether you've got some final comments you want to make before we close down.
Well, just to say huge thanks to Lindsey, Martin, Chris, Nicole, and to Dean, Gary, Jennifer, and Stuart for your contributions. I think you have given us exactly what we wanted, which is both stretching ambitions for what we should be achieving, but also practical solutions that feel to me not easy to implement, but implementable, which is critical. There's too much to focus on in a summary, but I think the thing that I come back, and we will summarize and publish all of this as part of our work, but the thing I come back to is the burning platform to make this happen. We had that burning platform during COVID. We seem to have lost it, even though we know the benefits, the economic benefits that Jennifer talked about, the clinical benefits that come from research. Somehow we've got to get that back so that we can force through some of the changes, whether it's to regulation, cross-agency working, availability of data, putting patients in the driving seat, getting research right across the clinical profession, not just in secondary care, and so on. And I hope that we can do that, some of that through our commission, but we're going to do that obviously working collectively and in the face of a challenging winter, no doubt, in the NHS. But yeah, final thanks to everybody for their participation. Thank you to everyone else who's attended, and of course thank you to my fellow commissioners for their excellent questioning. And I will let you all go, and we will look forward to staying in touch as we progress.